Darkheart Thicket returns as one of the new dungeons for Mythic Plus in Season 3. The dungeon will start with a 30-minute timer, so as long as you complete the dungeon within that window, you will upgrade your key. As you start off this dungeon, you'll encounter a variety of different deadly mobs. Mind-shattered screeches will frequently cast Unnerving Screech. This disorients players and deals damage, so make sure to kick this ability. Frenzied Nightclaws jump at random targets with Frantic Rip, dealing upfront physical damage and applying a bleed that deals heavy damage to that player until they are healed above 90% health. Dreadsoul Poisoners transform into spiders and poison random players with Nightmare Toxin, dealing damage and triggering a Nightmare Eruption when it expires or is dispelled. Players with this debuff should make sure to stay away from the rest of the group. Festahide Grizzlies are a priority mob. They deal huge party-wide damage through Maddening Roar. The scary part is this leaves a debuff on you increasing your damage taken from further roars, so nuke these down quick or use a defensive on the later roars. They also cast Spew Corruption, spawning pools on the ground as well as Nightmare Abomination adds. These mobs will fixate random players and leave trails of nightfall behind them on the ground that deal damage to anybody stood in it. Cleave these adds down while focusing the bear. Dreadsoul Ruiners will repeatedly cast Despair. Kick this as it deals moderate damage and leaves a healing reduction debuff that can be dispelled. These Ruiners also cast Star Shower, spawning several swirlies on the ground that players will need to avoid. Crazed Razorbeaks rush in the direction they are facing with Propelling Charge, stunning any player struck and dealing big damage, so tanks should make sure to face these mobs away from the group. After clearing this first trash, there's a neat little skip here so that you don't go over enemy forces count later. You'll encounter more Grizzlies before the first boss. They have the same mechanics but focus one down here so you don't gain multiple raw debuffs from both and get one shot. And then we'll engage the first boss. Archdruid Glaidalis uses different abilities depending on the current form he is in. While in caster form, he will target 2 players with Nightfall, creating a pool of corruption at the targeted player's position and spawning Nightmare Abominations. Avoid these pools at all times while cleaving down the adds. The boss will occasionally shift into cat form and Grievous Leap at the furthest target, dealing hefty upfront damage and leaving a grievous tear on the targeted player and the tank. This bleed will endlessly tick until the affected players reach above 90% health. Finally, Glaidalis will shift into bear form, attacking the tank with Primal Rampage. This ability deals massive upfront damage in a cone and knocks a player back. Following this frontal, he will charge forward, dealing huge damage to all players in his path. The tank should face the boss away at all times, ready for this, and use defensives to mitigate the damage. After defeating the first boss, you'll continue down the path to Oakheart. Here you'll encounter Rotheart Dryads that attack random players with Throw Spear and constantly leap away from your party. These Dryads will also target random players with Poison Spear, applying a 12-second poison dot and healing reduction. Rotheart Keepers will summon Vile Mushrooms. If these are disturbed, they will detonate, dealing heavy damage to nearby players and will probably one-shot you. Tanks should continuously kite away from these mushrooms so DPS can keep uptime. While active, they continually heal nearby plant life for 5% of their total health every 1 second, so you'll need to focus these keepers down first. Vile Blossoms will cast Root Burst under random players, causing the swirly to erupt after a few seconds, knocking players up and chunking their health. Finally, before the second boss, you'll find many Nightmare Dwellers. These Dwellers channel Tormenting Eye at random players, and if the cast is finished, the player will be feared for 4 seconds and take heavy ticking damage. Use kicks and AoE CC to deal with these mobs. Oakheart will spawn Strangling Roots throughout the encounter. Shortly after spawning these roots, they will become armed and root any player passing through them. Players should make sure to stay out of these roots unless equipped with a Freedom-like ability that can clear the root, and if players do get rooted, you'll need to burst down the root in order to break free. Generally, you can just ignore these roots though. During the fight, Oakheart will knock the party back with Shattered Earth. Players should make sure they're not getting knocked into a root behind them here, and healers should be ready to top the group up after taking heavy party-wide damage. Periodically, the boss will pick up the tank with Crushing Grip. This lasts 5 seconds and deals massive damage to the tank, so be prepared with defensives, and following this, Oakheart will throw the tank at a random player, dealing damage to anybody within the area. Around every 30 seconds, Oakheart will target the tank with Nightmare Breath, dishing out massive fire damage in a frontal cone and applying a dot to all players struck. Tanks face the boss away from your party at all times. On the path towards the third boss, you'll find Dragon Eggs lining both of the sides. If these eggs are disturbed by players, it will spawn a Hate Spawn Whelpling. These mobs only melee but quickly can get out of hand if too many spawn, so avoid standing or being knocked into these eggs. You'll also encounter large packs of Hate Spawn Slimes in this area. When these slimes die, they detonate a Dread Burst, dealing shadow damage to all players. This can definitely prove fatal if the whole pack dies at once, so be prepared to use defensives or stagger their deaths. The final mob you'll encounter here is the Blood-Tainted Fury. These mobs rush forward with Blood Assault, dealing moderate damage, transferring health back to the Fury and also knocking players back, probably into the eggs around the room. Dodge this charge as well as the blood bombs that drop from the sky, and when the Fury dies, it will shatter into 4 blood-tainted bursters. quickly burst these smallies down. They cast Blood Bolt, which will drain life from players, but more importantly, you cannot let the Blood Metamorphosis cast go off, otherwise it will spawn another Blood Tainted Fury that you'll have to take down. Now you're ready to take on Dresaron. This arena is again surrounded by the Whelpling eggs, so your main goal during this fight is to stay near Dresaron so you don't disturb and spawn more Whelplings. The main offender in you doing this will be Dresaron's Downdraft. During this cast, all players will be pushed away from the boss and suffer heavy party-wide damage. You'll need to run against these winds for the whole channel, otherwise you will be pushed to the outside of the arena, spawning whelps. Note that the further you are away from the boss, the stronger the winds are too. If whelps do spawn, the tank should just pick them up and cleave them down. The boss will also cast Earth-Shaking Roar, again dealing AoE damage to your group, but will also spawn falling rocks at a random player's location. Stay relatively spread during this encounter to minimize damage from this, and the targeted player should immediately move out from under the rocks. Finally, Dresaron will target the tank with Breath of Corruption, dealing massive damage in a frontal cone and reducing the struck player's armor. The boss does not follow during this channel, so tanks should sidestep it. Upon defeating the third boss, you'll jump down ready to take on the last trash. Dreadfire Imps will cast Firebolt at random players. More importantly, they'll apply a Dread Inferno to a random non-tank player. This Inferno will mark a large area around the player, and once it expires will fire a fireball at all players within the area of effect. The affected player should move away from the group, but make sure to kick these casts. Tainted Summoners will cast Shadow Bolt and debuff random players with Curse of Isolation. This curse doesn't harm the affected player, but will cause players within 6 yards to suffer shadow damage every 2 seconds. This player should make sure to move away from the group, especially the tank, or get a dispel if your group comp allows. Tainted Stalkers will dash to a ranged target and then back to melee, dealing shadow damage through Dark Hunt. Tormented Bloodseekers attack their target with Dark Soul Bite, dealing moderate nature damage and leaving a Dark Soul Drain that heals the Bloodseeker each time it deals damage. Tanks need to be vigilant here, as multiple bites can be extremely scary. It is dispellable due to being a disease. These mobs are your highest priority to kill. Tainted Deadeyes will shoot their target when out of melee range, and will frequently fire a scorching shot at a random target, applying a dispellable dot. These Deadeyes will also cast Shadow Decoy, teleporting away and leaving a Deadeye decoy at their original position. These mobs have low health and only auto attack, so generally you can just ignore them, and they despawn once the Deadeye is dead. Finally, we move on to the last boss of Darkheart Thicket, the Shade of Xavius. Throughout the fight, he will target a random player with Growing Paranoia for 20 seconds. This debuff follows the player, and if it comes into contact with another player, the debuff player is struck with Overwhelming Terror, dealing heavy damage and fearing the player for 5 seconds. Stay spread for this mechanic, especially if melee. The boss will also target a random player with Festering Rip, leaving a bleed that also reduces healing on the target. This should be dispelled by healers ASAP, especially if it's on the tank. Feed on the Weak will target a random player and deal huge damage over the duration of the channel. Use a defensive here to survive. Nightmare Bolt will deal unavoidable damage to random players and apply Waking Nightmare. This silences the player for 20 seconds unless they are standing next to another player, so if struck, make sure to go and stand near a party member that is not afflicted by Growing Paranoia. And once the Shade reaches 50% health, he will trigger an Apocalyptic Nightmare, dealing a single burst of large party-wide damage. Players should use a defensive here, and for the rest of the fight will have to dodge Apocalyptic Fires falling from across the room. But that's it for this boss, and that wraps up Darkheart Thicket and Mythic Plus. If this guide did help you or a friend out, then please feel free to drop a like down below and subscribe to your boy. And until next time, I'll catch you guys later.